All right. Hi, my name is Celine Coggins. I'm the Executive Director of Grantmakers for Education. I think we'll get underway. I know we have close to 60 people enrolled and only a small number already here, so I hope the room will fill up a little bit. I wanted to welcome you to our session today. This is actually the first of 3 Friday sessions that we're going to be holding on the question of authentic community engagement. This session is about how should philanthropy create more inclusive spaces. We're going to kind of walk and chew gum at the same time as we hold this day. Number one, we hope you get something out of this in terms of learning from other grant makers, how they're thinking about listening to communities as they do their grant making in this crisis moment. And at the same time, we set up this session before the COVID-19 crisis to really start to ask questions within our learning community at Grantmakers for Education and try to better understand how we can create more inclusive spaces. So I'm joined today by one of our board members and our conference committee chair, Nicole Rodriguez Leech of the Aprendes Foundation. Hi, Nicole. Thank you for joining us. And so let me just say a little bit about kind of why we've chosen this topic and what we hope to get out of today. So number one, this question of how do we do community engagement in an authentic way is something that is kind of near and dear to my heart and deep in my background. So for the 10 years before I came to Grantmakers for Education, I ran an organization that worked with teachers to help them have a voice in the policy issues that affected their classroom. And so at Grantmakers, we're mostly talking about the power differentials that exist between our grantees and those of us in the grant-making community. But I kind of wrestled with some of those same tensions when it came to teachers and policymakers who made those decisions. And so I know a little bit about this topic. In fact, I wrote a book on it called How to Be Heard for those who sit on the disadvantaged side. But I'm also really kind of humble about how hard it is to do well and fairly and inclusively. Since I came to Grantmakers for Education about a year and a half ago, I've really heard people wrestling with this challenge and tension. It predates this crisis that we're in right now. And at Grantmakers for Education, as an organization, we really need to listen to members on this. I hear two really distinct points of view when I talk to members. So one is GFE needs to be and is unique in that it is an exclusive space for funders. And funders need that kind of protected space to talk free of getting pitched to and all of that. And at the same time, we know to do our work well, we need to be proximate to those who are who have the needs that we seek to address. And so as equity has become the top priority of our network, especially racial equity, I'm wrestling with the tension of how do we make sure that we don't have a space that is out of step with what our members are looking for. Of course, we're able to do both, but I want to kind of just open up a conversation about how to strike the right balance. As you all know, we are planning to have our annual conference, God willing, in October in New York City. And I've had so many members approach me and say, I'd love to have some of my grantees, some of our partners in New York City attend the conference. As you all know, if you have a session accepted and you're a partner, then you are invited to the conference. But otherwise, we haven't really managed it that way. When people ask us, can we have partners come to the host event or partners come to the receptions? That has tended to be something we say no to. So I'm just thinking through this and really want to do it in conversation with our members and really learn from you all. So that's what we're kind of all about today on one level. At a second level, we really want to have the conversation about how are you learning from your partners now? How are you learning from those on the ground who are experiencing the greatest need in this moment? This is an opportunity for all of us to learn from each other. Everyone is kind of deploying a whole bunch of rapid response strategies. Everyone is trying to meet those needs that are so dire in this very moment. So we want to make sure that this conversation is a both and. On the one hand, We hope to invite you into a learning community at GFE that I, our team, and you all can learn from. And on the other hand, we hope you can learn from each other, especially as you're thinking through strategies in this moment. I also want to kind of set expectations and say, this isn't anything that, in terms of the conference, in terms of our other programming at GFE, that we feel like we have to solve in any major way today. So I'm inviting you into the early stage of a conversation that we hope will be ongoing. I'm making no promises about, where we'll land in a few months, but I just do want to start to listen more carefully to members. So we're going to have a conversation that focuses on two main topics. One is, how should GFE be thinking about including non-funders at the variety of events we hold? So that is the conference as a primary example, and that's why I think Nicole is my perfect partner for today. But also we do lots of things like site visits. We do webinars like this. Earlier today we had a webinar where we had partners in the out-of-school time space on the call. How does that work for you? How does it work best? What is best for your learning and how can we serve that need? And then second is, in this very moment, how can we learn from each other? What are you learning from those closest to the need you're trying to address in this moment? So we're gonna, as I said, walk and chew gum at the same time. For the first several minutes of the conversation, I'm going to turn things over to Nicole. I'm gonna ask her a few questions to kind of tee things up. And then what we're going to do is break the group into small rooms and just allow for a conversation among yourselves. Then we'll come back together and share out, and we'll invite you back in a month. So I hope that works out. And I want to say one more thing while I still have the microphone. Today is the due date for our session proposals for our fall conference. So we hope that many of you will apply. If you're planning to apply and need an extra day or two, please reach out to us. We're really excited and hope that by October, this moment will have passed and it will be a great opportunity for us to come together to build a new day. All right, with that, I'll turn it over to Nicole to say hello.
Oh, sorry, I had to unmute myself. Thank you, Celine, for asking me to join this conversation and for really being interested and taking the initiative to have a broader conversation outside, I think, of the folks in the GFE circles who have already been trying to kind of grapple with this, both formally and informally, either in the impact groups or just on the board or as members with our colleagues who we connect with outside of the conference or other formal GFE opportunities. Certainly this topic is one that I've think a lot about too. It feels very personal in some ways, and then, also very kind of professional if we were to separate those two. And I really appreciate you bringing in the conversation early, these dynamics of power and privilege. For me, kind of in the field, I think about just the early development of institutional philanthropy, frankly, was built on this notion that we know better, we meaning the philanthropy folks, the grant makers know better than communities about how resources should be allocated and applied. We know better than them about their own lives. I mean, that's frankly how it was premised. And so while we as individuals may not ascribe to that belief in particular, maybe our institutions do in some way over time. These notions have just kind of been embedded and now are almost invisibly working behind the scenes. So I think we have to be aware that this is not necessarily an intentional, personal, choice or preference, that maybe it's an institutional design issue, that some things are playing out in that way. However, there is maybe a personal element too that I think we have to kind of unpack, like really dig into for ourselves and unpack about how we experience power and privilege in our roles as grant makers. And so I think when we put some of those two elements, kind of the personal and interpersonal with the institutional together, it makes for kind of a perfect storm Sometimes it doesn't, really benefit our communities that we serve. And other times that those types of perfect storms lead to conversations like this that we're having today and that we'll continue to have moving forward. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to do that. In many ways, I think back, and I know we'll talk about conferences in a bit, but I think back to the conference that was in DC a couple years ago. And though the theme wasn't education and democracy per se, clearly being in DC on the heels of an election brings up some of these issues. And I remember two of our plenary speakers really talking to us about the fact that philanthropy should shift from thinking about itself as a body, a group of people who empower others, and instead step aside to let others stand in their own power. And I think though one might think of that as semantics, there's a real authentic truth behind that, which is around us giving something to other people that we have, that we think they should have, versus believing that there is power and smarts and a sense of what is needed and what is right in these communities that we serve. I think there's also this notion of service that I think is important for philanthropy to have, that we don't necessarily always talk through or talk about, that we are doing this work in service to others, and perhaps in service to the communities that some of us are also part. So I think that's another piece. And I think this notion of partnership is something that can be interrogated more. Sometimes, colleagues and I talk about our grantees as partners. Sometimes we say our grantees, like we possess them. These are things that are very subtle in some ways, but actually, if we just pay attention, are pretty explicit. And so I'm really excited to be able to kind of dig into all of these things and then think about them in the heels of this year's conference around democracy as well. I mean, this is exactly the time when we should be doing this, and this is exactly the place that we should be doing it. I think the last thing I'd want to say, just by way of initial remarks, is that I also do believe that spaces for funders, only, I guess, exclusive spaces are important. I think that sometimes funders are weary of speaking openly in front of folks that are not funders for fear of being judged or not having the right answer in the way that we're expected to otherwise. So I believe in kind of those types of safe spaces for funders as well. And like you were saying, that it can be a both and, not an either or, and that we can also have these other spaces that we're bringing the two together in a really careful and intentional way, rather than explicitly separating them as two different, compartmentalizing them in a way that has them really disjointed and disconnected. So I guess for me in this conversation, part of what I'm thinking about too is how in the conference or other GFE opportunities, or even in our own practice, we use these two pieces to really bring connection, as opposed to having there be these disconnections that might be a little bit more natural. So thank you. I'm super excited for this conversation and what's to come.
Awesome. So Nicole, why don't you and I just take a couple of minutes to model some of the questions that we're going to ask of others, and and you can just kind of tee up some initial responses for people to think about.
Yeah.
But first, I have to start with your right there in New York City right now. So what are some of your concerns at the present moment in terms of your grant making and what you're seeing, and kind of getting to that proximity?
Yeah. So yes, I'm in New York. It's a dicey place. It feels, quite frankly. I think both the grantees I have at Aprendes, which is a rather small foundation, we do work in New York City and also in Puerto Rico. We specifically work with younger stage organizations as well, and so they're always kind of teetering in many ways on the brink, particularly financially. And so some of the things that have been coming to us and have been real concerns are around, business continuity, like real basics, business continuity for those organizations that work, that are vendors of for New York City departments, or have contracts with them. Payment is always an issue, but now more than ever, as literally staff are working from home and don't necessarily have access to all the records and files and computer systems yet. And so there's real worry about just how they're going to receive their contract payments and be able then to kind of keep doors open in their own organizations. And then we have certainly some that are just whose primary mechanism or venue were schools. And so because they're closed, really trying to think through the community partners when they weren't necessarily always connected to other community partners, but were really interfacing with school personnel. So, how to really shift and pivot the mode of operation and mode of service in that way. And I'd say the only other thing is a lot of my groups are direct service providers. And so having to move that all virtual was just like, I think for many of us in our work worlds, kind of a technological feat, and trying to figure out platforms and do we have the money if we need to purchase something, things like that have been really top of mind, really nitty gritty in many, many ways. And I think because so much of the guidance is big picture guidance, we've heard a lot of need for just technical assistance.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you're trying to hold space for the voices that are not at the decision-making table at Aprendes?
Yeah, so, I think we benefit in some ways because we're rather small. And so it's, I've had conversation with all of our grantees, both in New York and in Puerto Rico. As you were mentioning before, I think there is a lot of processing that people desire to do. And so, while I think in other times, people are always happy to talk to a funder, right? I always say people are always happy to talk to me, right? Now I think the purpose of that conversation is just different and people want that contact. And so holding space, I think, has been really a big part of my role lately in a way that I've maybe tried to build into grant programs before, but wasn't always part of the day-to-day process. But I'm also just talking to colleagues, hearing about what they hear. I have a lot of smaller nonprofits in my group, but some of them partner with larger nonprofits. And so I need to be part of those conversations too, that my grantees aren't necessarily. So making sure that I'm talking with colleagues and keeping apprised myself and being to the best extent that I can, connector and facilitator. So while I am not an accountant and I am not, a bookkeeper and cannot advise on some areas that some of our grantees really do need support, I certainly can make those connections. Whereas in another time they may have been a little bit harder to make, or folks wouldn't be so obliging to talk to folks who weren't already in their networks. I think what we're seeing now is a lot of people coming together, pulling long hours, pulling a lot of time to try to support everyone as best we can.
That's helpful. So let's pivot to the conference and think toward a brighter day, or at least a day that will look different, where we'll have a lot to learn. So you mentioned a little bit about conferences past. I'm curious about this question, kind of what has been a highlight in terms of feeling like the conference was on target in being resonant with the communities we seek to serve?
So I think there are a couple that really come top of mind. One is, just kind of in representation. So I think last year's conference in particular was really strong in who was on the plenary stages. So we heard from a lot of people, but I think seeing kind of racial representation is really important, and diversity of view and perspective was really important. We also saw various roles represented, sometimes in single plenaries. And I think that in a lot of ways that the frequency that we saw that happen was probably more so at last year's conference than I have at others. Mm-hmm. I think there's also something about just naming issues, right? Naming topics that happened quite a bit at last year's conference. I think our opening plenary was kind of did that in many ways, which I find very exciting. Sometimes you really just have to name it and jump in. There's a lot of trepidation always, of course, and we want to be thoughtful and careful and responsible. But sometimes people wait, right, to have these conversations because they want to feel prepared. And sometimes you just won't be prepared fully, right? Not to the extent that you need to. I've also had some sessions that I've attended that I think have been really outstanding. And there are two that always come to mind for me. One was led by a colleague who asked us in the room to think about our own practice as grant makers. And I think we learn a lot at these conferences. I mean, this is like my favorite conference every year. It always has been. It's part of why I joined the board. However, in the past, I think my experience was more that, we learn a lot about topics or what other, colleagues are doing, but we don't always turn the mirror on ourselves. And I think having part of what's important for creating authentic and inclusive spaces is being able to take a look at ourselves, both, to an extent personally, but I think also just in our craft as grant makers, to just try to unearth what it is we're doing, what we're not doing, and examine those things because we can, and it's okay, right? So I often think about a colleague who used to be at Hewitt, who led a session, who asked us to do exactly this and talked about what was going on at Hewitt, but also gave us some experiential exercises to do together. It is a session that probably could have been a whole day or a half or a whole day in and of itself. And then the last thing I'll mention is a conference. At last year's conference, I attended a session on algorithms for determining suspension, expulsion, dropout. And the facilitator took us through the experience that the community went through, or one aspect of an experience that a community charrette that took place, I think it was in Minnesota. So that kind of firsthand jump in simulation, for lack of a better word, but really thoughtful, crisp, not superficial at all, pretty deep, are all things that have been, I think, that kind of big picture plenary, and then also this really kind of more intense examination have been highlights for me.
That's helpful. And any times you felt like we were off course or things you would wish for us to guard against?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, right? I think as happens everywhere, right? As happens everywhere, right? I think sometimes, first of all, you can't control what other people say, right? No matter how much preparation happens or what kind of talking points are kind of drafted or anything like that, you really can't control that. So there have been instances in conferences where I think people were allowed to kind of wax poetic without being checked or without real conversation, frankly. And those tend to happen probably more on a plenary situation because it's just such a bigger stage and people's time is very limited and they're kind of throwing out a lot and you don't catch everything. But I think it also happens in small groups because it's a group of people that tend not to necessarily know each other. And so, I think people make some choices about what feels comfortable for them to say, what doesn't feel comfortable for them to say. And so it's just, you don't have any consistency where these kinds of conversations are happening.
I think that's really helpful. And then just kind of a gut reaction, we're going to ask this of everyone. When you think about this notion of, using the conference or using any other GFE programming as a space to be more welcoming of others who are not in the funding community, what, I know you have mixed feelings because we've talked about this, but how would you articulate them?
The mixed feelings.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the tension that you described earlier as these kind of two narratives are essentially the tensions that I have as well. I believe that we as grant makers, we perform differently when our grantee partners are in the room sometimes. And so I think it is important also for our own learning to be able to have a space where we may be able to feel a bit more willingness to be vulnerable or honest than we might in front of others when we perform our jobs in front of others. And so I believe that like in there lies the tension, right? But I also believe that the others, our grantee partners, are also going through these experiences. We all perform in our jobs in some way, no matter how true and deep and authentic it is. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there's a certain kind of recognition that we need to have about accountability and what's at stake. In the scheme of things, what's at stake for us feels, quite frankly, far less than what's at stake for some of our grantee partners when you get close. And frankly, I believe that the best grant making that I see happens when you're close. However, we all have our own unique roles, right? Just as the sectors have their own unique roles. And that's okay too, right? So I think this notion of we get so stuck on the boundaries mm-hmm. that I think we need to relax some of those, right? Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean we don't need to have boundaries and uniqueness of role and maybe even mission sometimes, but certainly kind of your lane, right? Like when someone says stay in your lane, right? Like we each sometimes have different lanes. However, I don't think we're working against each other. And I think that's where that real engagement and partnership has to happen. I do feel that when it's disconnected, we can't possibly be doing our jobs well, no matter how smart we think we are, no matter how long we've been doing it, that all of these conversations can continue to happen. And then when we get to the point where we have to do our job that's separate from our grantee partners, that we should, just like I'm not out there delivering service. I did that for a long time ago. I am not the one. I don't do that well anymore. You don't want me doing that, right? And so I often say, like, we can each go to our various kind of corners, but we needed to come together first. And sometimes there's so much that gets bundled up in that coming together that can really be relaxed if we make certain new assumptions about each other and those types of conversations and spaces.
That's great. That's great. I think especially the point about accountability. So what we're going to do now is move people to small groups, and we're going to welcome you into this conversation, both on what are you doing now and what should we be doing now and in the future. So with that, the magic of Zoom is going to move us.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you all had a good... Yep, there's Celine.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. I hope you all had as rich a conversation as I did. I just wanted to take a few moments to just kind of wrap by sharing some thoughts from each of the different groups, again, with the intention of just us being able to learn. I will share out really quickly for my group and just say it was a great conversation. We spent more of the time talking about what people are learning now and some of the needs that they're seeing that are emerging in their communities, and just kind of troubleshooting, how do we think about the balance between the short term and all of the things that we're doing in rapid response right now with the long term and the questions of kind of what did we learn in this moment in time? And so that was really compelling to me, the challenges of the digital divide, the challenges of the mental health space. And then when we pivoted to talk about conferences, people raised ideas like, in other places they've seen like you're allowed to bring one partner, or partners are allowed to attend for one day, and thinking about kind of some of our work with subsets of the education field, and how do you strategically bring in partners for those conversations. So I will leave that off and ask, maybe Nicole, do you want to share a little bit from your group?
Yeah, absolutely. We had a good conversation with some questions, a problem of practice or two, and some ideas from other conferences. So I think one of the things, without sharing a lot of detail, I will say some of the things that came up. We talked about vulnerability and how when we're in spaces with practitioners, like they're vulnerable, like their willingness and ability to be vulnerable is far greater than ours. And that funders are kind of less willing, or maybe just generally less vulnerable for other reasons. We touched on kind of some issues around transparency. We talked about just the power dynamic within our own structures, so that, in our own role, some people may have decision-making authority, others not, and needing to think about this too, about from kind of within our own place within our institutions. We had, one of us talked about kind of these three lenses through which we look at some of this issue. One is around personal practice, the other around programmatic practice, and then this other around kind of a strategic engagement, broader picture. There was the recommendation of taking, as far as the conference is concerned, kind of taking things in small steps and baby steps, that people are coming to this with different, levels of thought, frequency of thought about a topic like this, and just to kind of account for that. I ditto a couple of things that you mentioned. One of the things that was shared that I will end with was that there is, someone shared that in their experience, they've had the opportunity to kind of talk about or think about why this is important, and maybe even more so how to do this. But what tends to be lacking is a space to kind of reflect and, like debrief and reflect with funder colleagues, and kind of internalize it. So we receive a lot of information, but that next step that's really missing is around that reflection and with one another, that can then be turned into like an applicable action. So some kind of takeaway for that individual. Some other really good ideas in there, but I think we'll stop there and I'll make sure.
Anyone else from Nicole's group want to say anything? I want to give people a space in the larger group if they would like to take it. All right, then maybe we should turn things over to Kyle Malone, who's on our national partnerships team, to share what happened in his group.
Great, thank you.
Or turn things over to someone else in your group, up to you.
All right, I'm going to do that. Rebecca and I had an awesome opportunity to talk to Erica and learn some exciting things that are happening at our foundation. And I would say that perhaps our theme, which Nicole really set up beautifully, was about relationships. So I'll turn over to Rebecca to capture some of those thoughts, and Erica.
Hi. Well, yes, we did have a really nice conversation with Erica, and it was fun to just be in the intimate setting with just the three of us. Erica, would you like to just share this in your own voice? Because this is what you were sharing.
And I think, just for clarification, I think the rooms were set in advance, and this, as I think I mentioned at the beginning, we had almost 60 people enroll, and we organized those into rooms, but it seems like this was, people had other things or a bed to crawl into by the end of the
room. No, it worked out.
So I know some rooms were different. My room was, I think, 5 or 6 people. It sounds like yours was only 1. So we're learning as we go.
Yeah, no worries at all. So we just talked about how quickly the foundation I work for was able to get money out the door. So we set up a COVID-19 resiliency fund, and we wanted to be really responsive. And so we raised $1 million in about 2 or 3 days. But what was really impressive was how quickly our team, our community impact team, got together to review applications. Even prior to that, we wanted to streamline the process so that it was as easy as possible for people in the community. And there were moments on some of our team calls where people who are cornerstones in the foundation, they wanted to ask more questions and do more, due diligence. And there were other people like me that said, we have to trust people in the community. And if there's a need, they know where their need is. They're asking for funds to do the work. Let's give them the ability to do what they need to do. And so I think we're developing new relationships. There are a couple people that we gave money to that we probably would not have had in some of our traditional portfolios. And so I'm really excited about that because I manage most of our community facing work. So I'm really encouraging more folks to take this as an opportunity to build relationships with more of our staff. And then also internally advocating for us to continue to refine our processes so that it's not burdensome and frustrating and discouraging for people that genuinely just need a little support to do what they're already doing.
And I'll have to tout Erica's success story by saying that they shaved their traditional grant making cycle from months down to a week to get the COVID funds out. So it was a remarkable transformation.
Great. Well, this has been really fruitful for me to be able to open this conversation, to be able to do a little bit of listening, and to know that we have folks within our membership who are interested in kind of grappling with some of these questions. So I want to say thank you to everyone. I also want to note that for GFE, to my knowledge, this is the first time we tried to do breakout chats, and so I'm pretty grateful that those just went pretty smoothly. I think they're really useful for being able to kind of spark conversation. And so thank you all, and join us again for a similar type of extension on this topic on May 1st. And thank you so much. Have a great day, and have a good weekend.